Money isn't everything. Unless you're a movie producer, then money is everything, and quality, promotion, and even good old common sense means nothing compared to the allure of the mighty dollar. Unfortunately, that attitude can lead to some pretty catastrophic financial failures in the movie business. With that in mind, I'm Will for What Culture, and here are 10 infamous movie box office bombs that cost obscene money. 10. Gemini Man. By modern standards, $138 million isn't a huge amount of money to be spent on a Hollywood blockbuster that seeks to utilize cutting-edge techniques, but upon watching Gemini Man, you get the distinct impression that funneling all those funds towards the effects department left them a little short in other areas, most notably the script. The 120 FPS frame rate was another unnecessary expense, and something that people just don't seem interested in. And instead of making the story as good as it could possibly be, the movie was more focused on its fancy new SFX toys, with Gemini Man greeted by a shrug as it went on to become one of the biggest box office bombs of 2019. 9. Call of the Wild. You wouldn't think that an old-fashioned adventure tale adapted from a novel that's over 100 years old and features an old guy and his canine companion as the two main characters would require an astronomical budget, but somehow this shaggy dog story cost a reported $150 million to bring to the big screen. Despite Call of the Wild's budget, at no point does the CGI used to bring Harrison Ford's faithful doggy friend to life manage to be fully convincing. The movie's box office performance is expected to lose the studio anywhere between $50 to $100 million, and the only memorable thing about it is the brilliant fan theory that wonders if the adventures of Han Solo and Chewbacca in the Star Wars universe are a drug-induced hallucination of Jack Thornton's, taking some mind-bending substances when out with his dog in Call of the Wild. 8. Evan Almighty. Bruce Almighty had earned over $480 million at the box office, so a sequel was almost an inevitability, even though Jim Carrey had opted against returning. However, no comedy should cost $175 million, especially a sequel to a popular movie that didn't even feature the return of the original's leading man. Nobody seemed to realize this at the time, and the higher-ups at Universal only had themselves to blame if there was any sort of surprise around the boardroom when Evan Almighty flopped hard. The focus appeared to be on making the most of the substantially increased effects budget at the expense of actually trying to make anybody laugh, and it only reinforced the notion that sequels to Jim Carrey movies that don't feature Jim Carrey are destined for failure. 7. The Mummy. How much does it cost to kill an entire cinematic universe? Looking at Tom Cruise's The Mummy, about $195 million. Universal seemed all too confident that their decision to reinvent their staple of classic monsters as stars of action-packed blockbusters headlined by A-list stars would be a success, and they even had a whole bunch of stars roped in for future projects before The Mummy was even released. It may have been saved from total embarrassment by a strong showing in China that pushed the box office over the $400 million mark, but it still ended up with the studio taking a huge financial hit that saw the dark universe abandoned at the very first attempt. Sensibly, their next stab at rebooting the Universal monsters resulted in the critical and commercial success of last year's The Invisible Man, which was made for roughly 4% of what The Mummy cost to produce. 6. The Lone Ranger. Westerns aren't exactly known as movies that cost vast sums of money to produce, and no one in their right mind should be spending $250 million on one. Keen to recreate the success of Pirates of the Caribbean in a different setting, Disney somehow decided that the Lone Ranger's eye-watering budget wasn't that great of a risk, only for it to tank spectacularly. The Lone Ranger cost so much that you could make Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven 10 times over and still have the money left over to cover Django Unchained. And yet this movie misfire couldn't come anywhere close to leaving any sort of mark whatsoever on the Western genre. Just a total waste of everyone's money and time. 5. Justice League. The budget of Justice League may have been higher than the GDP of several nations, but it apparently still wasn't enough to convincingly remove the mustache from Henry Cavill's face. Also, there's the fact that Whedon and Snyder aren't exactly similar filmmakers, and you can literally see the joins where Snyder's serious aesthetic ends and Whedon's quip-happy style begins, and it often happens multiple times in the very same scene. Justice League was finally completed under very heavy studio interference and bears the hallmarks of two opposing creative visions being awkwardly bolted together, and despite earning over $650 million, it still ended up in the red, thanks to the mammoth $300 million budget required just to get the damn thing finished. 4. Terminator Salvation, Genisys, and Dark Fate. Over $500 million in production costs were spent in attempting to reboot the Terminator franchise 3 times in 1 decade, and all we're left with is the feeling that the long-running sci-fi series may be finally done for good this time, after Dark Fate made it 3 for 3 in terms of sheer disappointment. In short, even the most profitable of the 3 movies performed mediocre at best, and Dark Fate bombed and lost the studio a fortune, potentially hammering the final nail into the franchise's coffin after spending a combined $540 million and still failing to stumble upon a recipe for success. 3. King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. King Arthur Legend of the Sword was designed to kick off the Knights of the Round Table cinematic universe, with 6 movies initially planned. To the shock of absolutely no one, that didn't happen, after the dark and gritty reboot sank without a trace at the box office. Guy Ritchie has proven to be wildly inconsistent as the director of expensive studio movies, but at least he rebounded with Aladdin after King Arthur Legend of the Sword failed to even recoup the $175 million budget at the box office. It could have been worse though, because if they'd been contractually obliged to pay for the acting lessons it would have taken to get David Beckham's horrible cameo up to scratch, then it would have cost at least twice as much. 2. 47 Ronin. Director Carl Rinsch made his feature debut on 47 Ronin the movie, and seemingly nuked his own career in the process, after struggling to get to grips with having a $175 million budget at his disposal for a big-budget fantasy epic that saw him crack under the weight of inexperience and studio interference. Rinsch was eventually kicked out entirely during post-production, leading to extensive reshoots to try and salvage a project that many were already predicting would be an unmitigated disaster. It turns out that they were right, and then some, with 47 Ronin failing to even crack $150 million at the box office while being savaged by critics, who rightly called it one of the worst blockbusters in recent memory. Throw on top of all of that accusations of whitewashing, and yeah, not a good film for sure. 1. DOLITTLE. Robert Downey Jr.'s first role of any kind in 6 years where he wasn't playing Tony Stark was arguably the biggest misstep of his entire career, as DOLITTLE quickly became one of the biggest box office bombs in history. The first Dr. Dolittle movie had tanked in 1967, so at least the most recent version lived up to its predecessor in one way. Woeful reactions from test audiences led to 3 weeks of hugely expensive reshoots, pushing the budget for the family-friendly fantasy up to the preposterous $175 million mark, in an effort to inject more comedy and broaden the appeal. These reshoots led to the famous dragon colonoscopy scene, which is every bit as bad as it sounds. Yeah, nobody should be surprised that this movie failed. And there you have it folks, 10 infamous movie box office bombs that cost obscene money. Doesn't it drive you a little crazy these films just burned billions of dollars for nothing? Let us know in the comment section below, and remember to like, share, subscribe, and all that other funky YouTube internet stuff. I'm Will for What Culture, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.